Hello and welcome to another episode of the Public Affairs in Practice podcast. As part of our, I suppose, world tour of public affairs, we've been to Canada, America, New Zealand, and this week we've landed in Australia. Sadly, I am not in Australia. I am sitting in North London, but my guest today, Tracey Cain, is in Australia, indeed in Sydney, I think, if I'm correct, Tracey.
Right.
So, thank you. Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. That's really kind. Look, let me just give you a bit of a build-up, if I may. So Tracey specialises in reputation and crisis management, and has done particular work across private education, legal disputes, litigation, and I think in particular health and aged care. I always feel slightly churlish when I say, how many years one has been in the industry. But anyway, with more than 30 years of experience in journalism and in politics in Australia, in the White House in the US as well. So that's always hugely interesting to anybody who does politics and public affairs. In particular, Tracey focuses on governance and operational issues, and from a hugely impressive, CV. She was the first in-house director of communications at an Australian law firm. Later, a founding CEO of a health and aged care foundation, and then established APA, which I think was a leading consultancy in Australia, before becoming part of H Advisors in 2003, where she is now the CEO. So, Tracey, sorry, that's the big build-up, that's the drum roll. But look, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's an absolute pleasure. That is a very big build-up. I'll try my best to live up to it.
I know, I'm sure you will. But look, you touched on your career and your background, but at the moment, you with H Advisors, you lead. I don't think it's an understatement to say one of the biggest public affairs consultancies in Australia, and you may say it's the biggest as well. But talk us through that route into the profession and how what you do and that journey, how that shaped how you practice your public affairs today.
Well, Stuart, it's been a long history of 30 years, and I think you've known me for most of it, so I'll give you the brief overview. I think my background's probably slightly different to a number of other practitioners in that I was a journalist, I have a law degree, and I was a political advisor, as you say, both in Australia and the US. And I think what fascinated me was looking at how do you manage issues and crises in very heavily regulated environments, and also around legal disputes. And that doesn't necessarily just mean litigation. It means all of the tribunals and all of the watchdog agencies, etc. And during my time in the US, I saw a lot of integrated government relations, public relations firms that looked at a whole approach to managing such issues, not just managing the media or not just doing the lobbying, but actually looking at how you bring all these levers together and how you pull them in different ways to get different outcomes. And so we were one of the first firms in Australia to set up a sort of integrated model, focused solely on regulated sectors, focused solely on issues and crises. And 30 years later, we're still here, so we've done something right, which is always good. And as you say, a couple of years ago, we joined a global firm, H Advisors, where there is this global network of like-minded practitioners. Some have similar backgrounds to me and to our team here, and some have slightly different backgrounds as regulators and as sort of senior public servants. So it's a really nice mix that enables us to, I guess, take advantage of the fact your market is not unique in many ways. The ideas and the thoughts and the public affairs questions can be the same, but the way of going about them is very different and does require local knowledge and on-the-ground presence.
Yeah, look, you raise an important point, which is that, I remember back in my career, again, as you know, I worked for law firms, so I don't have a law degree or anything along those sort of lines, but went into sort of legal firms with the sort of public affairs hat on, if you like. And I think one of the challenges that we faced in sort of establishing that model here in the UK, when I was at DLA Piper and at BDB Pitmans for a long time as well, was that in some senses, whilst the legal sector would understand that necessity to get the communications bit right, whether that is the crisis media side of things or whether that's the sort of the more political and I suppose policy regulatory side of things, very often it was our own industry, our public affairs industry, that didn't get it. And then when you're trying to sell those services and products more generally, is yes, you can get to the sort of higher end market, and maybe that's absolutely fine in terms of building a business. But the more sort of public affairs end of it were, you're expensive, your lawyers, etc., and we weren't. How is that? Did you find that sort of challenge as well, or was basically Australia just a bit more educated than the UK?
I'm not sure Australia is any more educated than anywhere else. I think the advantage we had is that we were born out of a law firm, and as a result, in our initial years, a lot of the partners and a lot of the lawyers at that firm continued to use us and some of them still do 30 years later. So in that sense, we always had a sort of base level of engagement with the legal sector, and it's one of the biggest firms in Australia. So it was a good starting point, which enabled us to lock straight into that CEO board level, and we've stayed at that level ever since.
Okay, yeah, no, that's well, yes. If you can get to there, then that's certainly enough to, as you say, build the business and you keep the team interested as well.
Yeah, and look, I think we were lucky that we parachuted straight in at that level rather than having to grow and build up to that level, and that was very lucky for us.
And when you look at the public affairs market sort of now in Australia and how has the way the influence, and obviously, sorry, I say Australia, of course, I realise Australia is not just a country, but a series of states and a series of governments, not just one. Even in my limited knowledge of Australia, I understand that. So, but in terms of the way that you do your public affairs, has it changed? Has influence changed over the years as well?
Look, I think it has, and I'd like to congratulate you on your knowledge of Australia, and you don't think we're Austria, so congratulations there. We sometimes punch above our weight, but otherwise we kind of slip along at the bottom end of the earth and nobody notices us. But in answer to your question, 30 years is a long time in public affairs, and you would expect mass changes. I think there are 3 or 4 that really stand out to me over that time. The first one is around the political landscape, that a number of really significant changes have occurred, that it's now dominated by professional staffers and people who really have only worked in politics. And that does have an influence on how they approach issues and questions and regulatory ideas. Equally, a bit like the UK, but perhaps a bit slower here, we have had a rise of a populist conservative parties. And I think because we have a Labor government in in Australia, it's made them much bolder because they won an election with a landslide. They have a very, very severe majority that doesn't really have an opposition to it at the moment because those conservative parties are still sort of wrestling it out between themselves. But what it means is you have a government that's bold but is taking a very short-term view and is very heavily basing its decisions on the public narrative. So looking at short-term unstrategic thinking rather than the long-term incremental change in policies that I think we have seen for the past 30 years, that rather than those true believers coming into to politics and looking at what do I believe in, what is the ethos of my party, what do I wish to do, it is more what's in the media, what's on social media, what do I need to respond to, and the sledgehammer comes down. So that has been a really interesting change. And we're particularly seeing it that we have a federal budget coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we're seeing a government float quite a substantial tax change, and it's the exact tax change they ruled out before the last election. But there is no criticism because they're responding to public narrative. So I think that whole shift has been a really interesting exercise in your question, how do you influence and who do you influence and when do you influence? It is quite different now on that political landscape. Equally, there's a lot of discussion in Australia around intergenerational policy and the economy and what that's like for the next generation and the one after, and a lot of discussion around we can't spend on older generations and expect younger generations to pay for it, and so let's instead look at increasing taxes. Let's change some of those systems that affect the older people. Now, the policy and the discussion is interesting, but it's only a matter of time before some of the younger people work out, wait a minute, you're taxing my inheritance, you're changing the funding that will affect my inheritance. And we've got a massive shift in wealth from one generation to the next occurring at the moment and over the next 10 years. And so the intergenerational discussion doesn't really cover that in the same way. This is new territory for Australia. So I think that's something that's different, is that narrative that's coming in about how to be responsible for future generations without actually penalising them through the back door. And thirdly, as Australia becomes more involved globally, I think we've seen the rise of discussions around food security, fuel security, around foreign investment, around immigration, and some of it has really come to the fore at the moment because of what's happening in the Middle East. But it is fueling the rise of these more conservative parties because it is playing directly into their narrative about Australia being under threat, about we need to close the doors, we need to focus on ourselves. So they're all feeding into each other and changing the landscape. And I'd have to say, if you then throw in the rise of AI on top of that, you're getting a large number of people who are only getting their news and their information from an AI search, from one of the LLMs. Now, in Australia, the LLMs cannot access behind the paywall for the media. So you're getting a disproportionate, scraping of material from direct websites, direct stakeholder communications, LinkedIn pages that people control themselves. You're starting to see those on the rise. And so how important is that media if it's locked behind the paywall? How important is it if 70% of people, or the number is substantial, I'm not sure whether it's 70%, but how important is it if most people are not actually engaging with it? So there are some really key public affairs questions, and they do, in my world, if I look at sort of crisis management and issues management, they absolutely play into that. That there was a school of thought that crisis management is media management. Now, the media stuff is inconsequential almost, that this is about a changed environment that is changing faster than ever before. It is about growing stakeholder relationships. It is about taking them through the change and the crisis and building the trust and building the insight that they have into your vision and where you're going. It is not so much about pumping out the standard lines that you pre-prepared earlier when a crisis hits. And I think all of these changes have significantly had an impact on the work that we do as a team and the way we approach it. And it is important to grow with the market. And that's essentially, I guess, why we've survived for 30 years, because we have changed and grown with the market. But I do think that the PR firms that have rebranded themselves public affairs but really only do media, or the 1 and 2 people operators, just do not have the sector expertise, do not have the current approaches and ability to deal with crises and issues. And I think they should be very concerned about their future.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you entirely where it comes to the crisis side of things. In particular, I mean, you've raised a whole series of different issues, very many of which sort of resonated as you were talking through, and you can hear echoes in some of the conversations I've had with, public affairs practitioners from other countries, but particularly here in the UK. But when you're talking about crisis, yeah, we still are slightly fixated on that media / social media, element of, you can get the message right. Whereas, and what I was trying to point out is, the ones with the real power are governments, are politicians. They're the ones reacting to that public sentiment. Yeah. And there's something must be done. The changing of the levers, the taxes, the regulations, etc. That is the change that has the real long-lasting impact, I think.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and increasingly government is actually a stakeholder, because in Australia we have a number of independent agencies that are watchdogs and authorities around environment, around cyber breaches, around child protection, around a whole range of things. And if something goes wrong, the government is actually a key commentator defending the regulator. And it's been really interesting to see that. So the idea that you just massage the media and the social media, what about the 15 people that have bought your product or attend your whatever or use your service, who then go and complain to the media and pump the story along or put things on social media? And it has very much shifted that focus to further up the food chain, to making sure those stakeholders know what's going on, making sure they're on side, making sure you've spoken to government, making sure there isn't a knee-jerk reaction in a regulatory sense that may feel very, very, very deserved at the time, but in fact, if you knew the information, it probably wouldn't be. So it's changed that stakeholder environment, and I think it has changed crisis management quite a lot. I think you're right.
And you brought another sort of point to my mind as we're talking this through, which is that, as you say, government as a stakeholder, and governments across the world, here in the UK particularly, and I'm sure Australia sounds like it's the same, which is that you sort of, you put these difficult issues into a regulator to make it independent of government, and, they can do the admin-y stuff and do the fines, and, I'm sure they do lots of other stuff as well. Anyway, but they do that, until a crisis comes along, and then the government goes, well, actually, the thing about it is, and then they effectively apply pressure indirectly, maybe sometimes directly, on those regulators. So they're not really, in that sense, in a public policy setting, as independent as they're initially made out to be, because otherwise, government isn't doing very much, and politicians need to be seen to be doing things and being in charge of a challenge or an issue that comes through.
And absolutely. And certainly where there is, if I look at the rise of cybersecurity and those questions around a cyber breach, that some of the early ones, the government would come out and criticise the organisation for not managing the crisis well enough. The government then set up a notifiable data breach scheme, set up a regulator, and now there is a prescribed process that you must go through that in order to report and effectively communicate around your cyber breach. And so government is increasingly moving into that crisis space. It's interesting. About a year ago, I gave a speech, and it had to do with independent schools and how crisis management has changed over a 30-year period. And as part of that, I went back and looked at some of the early crises that we'd worked on, and they were all individual exceptions to the general system. They were the head of a school who was hit by a drunk driver and died. They were the finance person that committed financial fraud. They were these sort of issues. Whereas now I look at the issues and they're about systemic failure. They're about a failure in culture. They're about a cyber breach that needs reporting and you need to move through those processes. They're about child protection. They are about systemic things that largely involve government and regulators as the solution, not the types of crises that you had 30 years ago. And tracing that through with some societal changes and I guess demographics changes around the schools was a really interesting exercise. And I suspect, one of the things I'd like to do this year is do the same thing around things like aged care and disability care in Australia, because I think that sort of passage is a really interesting insight into where the public affairs market's going, but equally where the smart players are going in terms of their public affairs, and whether they're doing it in-house or by consultancy, they're certainly doing it differently.
I'm sure there's some parallels there in other countries as well, the UK in particular, as you talk about independent schools. I've done some work in the independent school sector, and I'm just trying to map that in my mind to see if there might be some read across there as well. And I think you're probably right for here as well, is my instinct. And just a sort of slightly side issue, you talked about government and responding to that public pressure. Do you think the frequency of elections has an impact on that as well? I mean, obviously from the UK side of things, it's sort of every 4 or 5 years, and government can sort of make it up as it goes along, depending on, how popular it is. I know we did have a sort of a slight period of the Fixed Term Parliament Act where that was taken away from government, but, they've got that power back again after it was sort of re-scrapped by Boris Johnson. Do you think that regularity of elections and I suppose the power of the states as well come into this maybe? Do you think that sort of is part of the pressure on the government and the state governments to sort of be a bit more reactive to public pressure, populist, if you like, in the way that they approach things?
Look, I think it does. The difference we've got in Australia is, while our system is modelled on the Westminster system, voting is compulsory and you get fined if you don't vote. And we also have a preferential voting system. So that does, if I look at the rise of some of the right-wing parties in the UK, it is not able to be that fast here because of the system, and it just takes a while to flush through. And some of our states have fixed terms. Certainly New South Wales, the state with the largest population, has fixed 4-year terms. Some of them don't, and federally there isn't a fixed term. So it does have an impact. Not as big an impact as I saw when I was in the US, where the political campaigning over there, about 80% of campaigning was what they called get out the vote, which was getting people on the register and priming them to vote. And the 20% was about what you do on voting day. Whereas in Australia, it's 100% what you do when you cast your vote. And increasingly, there's a lot more pre-polling and postal votes. So that voting day is not a day anymore. It's a period of 2 to 3 weeks, which also makes a difference. But the political system, of course, influences how those within it. I don't want to say play the game because it's not a game, but in a sense, you are playing the numbers to make sure you get re-elected. And I think unless you have a landslide, as our current government does, I think you are automatically locked into what's our term going to be, when's our election, how do we peak at that point?
And if a client sort of comes through your door, Tracey, and sort of knocks in and said, look, we've got this particular challenge, and, whether it's in, healthcare or independent education, are there certain sort of key points or key totems that you would look at to make sure that they can influence that policy development process? Are there some things which are sort of pretty common to most campaigns, and then obviously then you'd put in the more strategic stuff as well?
There are. The one advantage I think we have, which makes us a little bit different from some of the other firms, is we have genuine experts in particular sectors. So we have an expert in aged care, an expert in health, an expert in nuclear, an expert in energy and resources, private education, etc. Anything that's regulated, we have experts in there. So what that means is, in that initial conversation, they know what's realistic, they know what's going to fly and what's not going to fly. So we are fairly brutal in our advice. If it's not going to fly, we don't want to take money to test it, because we can tell you it's not going to fly. And being able to say, we know the history of the policy, we know what the minister thinks, we know what the minister's policy advisor thinks, we know what the department thinks, we're aware of what's been in the media and on social media over the past 12 months, we know what the Royal Commission recommendations were, we know how many have been implemented. To be able to come to the table and have that initial conversation with all of that in somebody's head is absolutely critical, because it allows us to then say, what you're asking for isn't realistic. The government doesn't work that way. They've already knocked back 3 things that are similar to that. But there is this pool of money, there is this funding opportunity, there is this policy, there is this emphasis. This is how you are best to manoeuvre with government, and these are the people you need to influence, and this is how you go about doing it. And that is the best initial conversation, and it's one we have multiple times a day. And some people go with us, and some people say, no, we want to push ahead with what we want. And I'd have to say, I haven't heard of it working, but I'm sure there are cases where it has.
Because we've looked at Australia for a long time for inspiration. I mean, I suppose my slight humble brag, when I did my PhD in politics a very long time ago now, even then, so this was, I won't say the year 97-ish, something along those lines, just before, and I was doing it about social democracy and left-wing parties. Obviously, at that stage, the left-wing parties in Europe, to some extent, France, etc., had been in power. Labour in the UK hadn't, whereas in Australia and New Zealand, but in Australia, Hawke, Keating, etc., were the ones absolutely, winning elections, forming governments, pushing ahead. So we often look for inspiration. And I think particularly at the moment, across those public policy challenges, social media bans, use of tobacco advertising and branding and those sorts of issues as well, Australia does seem to be absolutely at the forefront of public policy change. Do you think is there a reason why? I mean, does it go back to your point about listening to the public, or is it more than that? Because Australia does seem to be absolutely pushing ahead with these things, and other countries are looking for inspiration and are then copying, frankly.
Yeah, look, I don't know whether Australia is pushing ahead. I think it just gets a lot of attention, and I don't know whether that necessarily collates. But what I'd say to you, to pick up on your question about history, is Australia had a period of very, very significant prime ministers. The Hawke era, the Keating era, the John Howard era. They were stunning leaders, all three of them. And they did a lot of future planning and future thinking. And as a result of that, Australia has a very, very strong social welfare system. We spend a lot of money on it. We have a very, very strong social welfare offering for those who are in need. Now, there is a view that is worth protecting. And so I think sometimes when you have questions around mental health, as a result of social media use, when you have questions around generations accessing tobacco and the impact that has on the health budget in terms of cancer treatment, etc., there is a lot worth protecting because they are very big cost items in a very, very big social welfare system. So I think sometimes Australia responds a bit more strongly in order to protect what those three leaders set up, or at least pave the way for, in the way they manage the economy and in the way they looked into the future. So I think it might be more we've got more to lose than us being out there in terms of policy development.
Oh, that's interesting. No, well, look, I mean, you're right. I mean, three, huge leaders, internationally, renowned as well. And does that sort of, if you like, I was going to say social norm or consensus agreement, whatever we want to call it, around those sort of issues, does that apply to the individual states across Australia as well, or is that very much a sort of sorry, again, my ignorance of how the political system works, but is that very much a sort of a national thing, and then the states all don't quite sign up to that, or is that's pretty universal?
At the moment, we have a Labor government federally, and almost all of the states and territories are also Labor governments. So there is very much a moving in the same direction or a similar direction, with a bit of arguing about transferring costs federally to state or state to federally. And there's a bit of theatre around that, shall we say, to make sure that there doesn't end up a trend where one level of government is saving a lot of money at the expense of the other. But generally speaking, at the moment, they are moving in the same direction. And therefore, there is a bit of consensus and there is a bit of backing in some of those policies with state legislation as well as federal legislation.
So, in terms of that structure piece, and sort of where influence lies, that's pretty static at the moment. But again, as you indicate, if there starts to be changes politically, I guess that sort of that relationship between state and nation comes a little bit more under stress as well.
And it will. Australia moves over time, and equally federally at the moment, the Liberal Party, which was the traditional opposition, has really been reduced to quite small numbers, and we've started to see the rise of parties further to the right. That's going to be interesting to see whether that actually translates in a compulsory voting system where there is preferential voting, whether that's actually going to translate to seats and therefore a shift in parliaments and a shift in priorities.
So if we were sort of now sort of reflecting on that time, Tracey, and sort of we're looking ahead. I know we've touched on some of these, but big changes in public affairs. Is it to do with that change in the nature of potential change in nature of politics? And I suppose what I'm thinking is, again, what organisations can do, what clients can do to sort of prepare themselves for those potential changes and shifts.
I think the biggest one is the globalisation of policy and thought leadership, and everybody dealing with the same challenges and the same issues in some ways. So I think there is a great value in being able to get global intelligence and to hear. It's all terrific that Australia responds positively to the UK's generational ban on tobacco purchasing. but what does that actually mean here? And has that been a success over there? And we've got through Edge Advisors, we've got a number of clients in the UK that are saying, what success has the social media ban been in Australia? Our clients want to know, do they push for that? Do they not push for that? So I think that globalisation is really, really important. The second thing I'd say is in public affairs, the generalist is dead in the water. The absolute specialist in a particular sector, not in a skill, but in a sector, is on the rise. And being able to, we talked a bit about those initial conversations, being able to have those conversations in a way that's meaningful and cuts through, tell us about so-and-so, what does that stand for? To be able to cut through that quickly and get results, I think is going to become more and more important. And the single operator, the single skilled individual, I think the days are numbered if you don't have a bigger house. The second thing I'd say is that there is a limit to the number of big changes that a government will wear in a short term. And if they are responding, as they are in Australia, with the sledgehammer, they're not going to bring the sledgehammer down twice a week. So how do you battle to get more aligned with the narrative, more aligned with the political imperatives, more aligned with the interests of the politicians, more aligned with the policy direction of the department? How do you line all of those up and get ahead of the other 50 million applications or million discussions that government is having? So I think being able to cut through with specialists is going to be increasingly important. The other is about broadly engaging with stakeholders. And I mean the very broadest sense that this is not about waiting to see if a crisis happens and then wheeling out the standard lines. I think crisis management is stakeholder management now, and it starts a long, long time before the crisis. It is about building the relationships and building the trust so that you can effectively manage. And I think the organisations that are recognising that government relations and corporate communications or media or whatever they call it are not these separate departments that should never speak to each other. There actually should be one department that should be plugged in at quite a senior level and should be focused on relationships and expertise. So I think there's some changes in structure around in-house public affairs. And I think a recognition that if your in-house team maybe has 1, 2, 3 people, that really isn't a match for 25 people in a consultancy. And you do at some point need extra networks, extra knowledge, extra ideas and extra insight. So I think the rise of the small team and the specialist consultants is definitely on the agenda. And the last is being mindful of the role of government, not just as a target for a public affairs campaign, but a stakeholder within that campaign, and recognising that there is they have skin in the game in terms of protecting the reputation of a regulator, protecting a system and a structure that they have set up to deal with complex issues, regulatory failure, or regulatory breaches.
Tracey, wow. I mean, all I can say is you've set out so many different challenges there, both to consultancies and to in-house as well. I'm going to have to do some serious self-reflecting on that basis as well. I think that's a big order. But look, thank you for your time. That's hugely appreciated, and look, lots for everybody to reflect on. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure, and I'll talk to you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.